It's nice to see so many of you here for this kickoff event of our 2012-13 series on peripheries. Ordinarily, it's bad news when someone schedules a really big event on top of the event that we've scheduled, and I gather that just down the hall in this same building we have Pete Townsend, the bona fide rock and roll superstar, speaking. But looking out at this nearly full auditorium, it's gratifying to think that our own academic superstar has managed the competition from the popular sphere very well. The timing will be, as usual, for those of you who don't know, we generally take a quick break at 6 p.m. so that those who have to leave around then or who need to stretch their legs or get out to a restroom or something can do so. It's just 2 or 3 minutes at the most at that time. People can exit as we sort of reorganize for the Q&A, which we'll do until about 6:30, at which point we'll be done. I want to announce our next event 2 weeks from today. We have Margaret Livingstone, a neurobiologist from Harvard University. She specializes in the neurobiology of vision, and is in particular on visual arts and painting. And she'll be talking about how we see a painting and how artists understand the neurobiology of what they do. If you're going to attend that event, please pre-register. It's very easy, just a few clicks on our website. Today's talk is the Dr. S.T. Lee Distinguished Lecturer in the Humanities. I want to thank Dr. Seng-T Lee for his generosity in supporting the forum. Our entire series, and much else that we do besides, is made possible by the School of Arts and Sciences. And I want to express particular gratitude to Rebecca Bushnell, the Dean of the Arts and Sciences, for all her encouragement over the years. Now, as many of you know, we organize our main events each year around a topic, some important topic in the humanities. We don't just arrive at these randomly. We come up with them by putting together a topic and a person, a particular scholar on the faculty of Penn whose research and teaching are in that area and who can thus help to coordinate the programming and to assure some rigor and thoughtfulness in the way that we address it. Directing Peripheries is Kevin Platt, professor of Slavic languages and literatures, graduate chair of the Comparative Literature and Literary Theory program. Kevin came to Penn in 2002. He's been an animating and vital presence here ever since. He's the author, editor, or translator of 5 books, including most recently Terror and Greatness, Ivan and Peter as Russian Myths. Kevin spent last year as a Guggenheim Scholar in St. Petersburg, so he and I were obliged to do much of the planning for the series this year via Skype, back and forth between New Jersey and St. Petersburg. This experience led me to suspect that a fully functional telecommunications infrastructure is another Russian myth. Perhaps he could write about that one in the next book. But aside from some technical frustrations, it's really been a great pleasure and a productive opportunity for me to work with and learn from Kevin. So here to introduce Dr. Wallerstein to you is Kevin Platt, our topic director.
Thank you, Jim. That was very sweet. I didn't know I was going to get introduced like that. Just a few words about our topic to start, which is peripheries this year. It's a complicated term, which really cannot be thought or uttered without invoking a larger conceptual apparatus. It's hard to think about peripheries without thinking about cores, or whatever it is that makes the peripheries, centers perhaps, that make the peripheries what they are. As always for the forum, with which I've been involved as a member of the steering committee. What is it called, our committee? The faculty advisory board for several years, we try to think broadly about our key concepts and to come up with concepts which allow scholars working in all kinds of fields to come together and learn from each other and to enrich their own encounters with the sort of key terms which lie at the center of many different modes of work, but which sometimes take on various different forms for different scholars and working in different disciplines. So that this year, peripheries could relate to peripheral vision and film, or peripheries in the organization of a formal work of art, peripheral nervous system versus the central nervous system. Yet for me personally, the geographical and the social connotations of this term are perhaps the most central and pertinent. The world we live in is organized into centers and peripheries according to hierarchies of culture, of power, and of economic might, not to mention of military might. And sometimes these hierarchies, of course, coincide, and sometimes they diverge from one another. It's these concentric circles, sometimes overlapping circles, which make places like New York, for many, the center of the world, and everything else peripheral. The peripheries of cities, the peripheries of our national geography, the peripheral segments of society, these are the research questions which I think lie at the center of the work of many of the scholars working at the Humanities Forum this year. How are we to study peripheries, located as we are in general here at Penn in the center? So when Jim and I were discussing whom to invite for this lecture series, really the first name to come up, and I think it was within probably 10 minutes, 2 minutes of beginning a discussion of whom to invite, was that of Immanuel Wallerstein. Dr. Wallerstein has done more over the past 5 decades, to orient scholarship and the attention of the educated public at large on the problems of centers and peripheries, on the organization of space and geography across the globe, intercenters and peripheries, than anyone else currently working. And that is not an exaggeration, it's simply a fact. He is one of the most influential economic and historical thinkers working at present. He's the former president of the International Sociological Association, and he was chair of the International Gulbenkian Commission on the Restructuring of the Social Sciences in the 1990s. Before joining Yale University, where he is now a senior research scholar in 2000, Professor Wallerstein taught at Columbia, at McGill, and at Binghamton Universities, and he was a visiting scholar at many other institutions. Professor Wallerstein is the pioneer and the leading proponent of the enormously influential mode of analysis that has come to be called world systems theory, which takes the largest possible unit of analysis always, and then works from the outside in towards the particulars. It maps the complex relations among countries and regions as a dynamic system of flows between a core and its peripheries over centuries of human history. We have been immensely fortunate that Professor Wallerstein agreed to come and speak to us today as the lead-off speaker for our series on peripheries this year. I cannot imagine a better beginning to our lecture series. Please join me in welcoming Professor Immanuel Wallerstein.
I'm delighted to be here. Up to a minute ago, you saw on this board a big sign that said that the forum was a forum on peripheries. And then you saw underneath it my title. I was asked to give a title, and I gave a title called Cores and Peripheries in the 21st Century. So I'd like to start talking about words. Words are terribly important. They're the principal mechanism of communication between people. They aren't the only one, but if you try to say anything a bit complicated, you really need words. problem with words is that they breed enormous confusion because people use any important word in quite different ways and refer to quite different things, and quite often they're directly contradictory, the different usages of the word. So I tried to think of why people, not just in the humanities, but more generally, why people talk about peripheries. What are they interested in? What does the word signal to them? And it's the question, what is a periphery, and why should we even bother discussing it? Well, I think one of the meanings, and these meanings are not exclusive, one of the meanings to people when they discuss peripheries is that they are talking about how we ought to struggle on behalf of the oppressed, who are perhaps the forgotten peoples. Somehow groups have been left out of our vision and our understanding of reality, and we've got to put them back into the center of our vision and reality. So, and that's a good thing to do. And then there is the kind of meaning that is a justification of the agency of the oppressed, because quite often when people talk about peripheries, what they're saying is there's the assumption that the people with power sort of run everything and run over everybody, and whereas we want to say that the people in the periphery, or the peoples in the periphery, or the groups in the periphery really have agency, and we ought to study and understand and support, but also study and understand how this agency expresses itself and has always expressed itself. And then there's another tonality to peripheries. It's the tonality, culture is really the key thing, and historically people have put too much emphasis on political economy. So we're going to redress the balance, or even overturn the balance, in favor of something which we call culture, which is somehow more basic or more fundamental or more important than political economy. And then there's a kind of another tonality to periphery. That is, that the view from the periphery of what's going on is better. That is, you see the world more clearly from the periphery because you're somehow not drowned in the dominant ideology. So people who are on top have an unclear view of reality, but people who are somehow on the bottom or peripheral have a much clearer one. And then there's been, especially lately, the sense that what we need in the world is a civilizational alternative, and that can only come from people in the periphery. So all these different meanings float around, and as you can see, you can have several of these meanings simultaneously. But it's a kind of gooey combination of many different tonalities. Now, then there's something called core and periphery, or core hyphen periphery, or core strophe periphery. And that's a little bit different. First of all, when you talk about core periphery, you are saying, or at least I think you're saying, that it's a relationship and not an essence. Now, that's very important, because that means you can't talk of core and periphery separately, because what you're talking about is the core-peripheral relationship. That's crucial. And then there's a second thing, which is that core-periphery is put forward, at least I put it forward, as something which provides what is often called the axial division of labor. What holds somehow a system together is this particular axis, and an axis, of course, is a single structure which has a certain kind of tension in it. Now, if you look at the historical development of this latter term, core periphery, as a relationship, the man who put it on the map, it isn't that he invented it, but the man who put it on the map is an Argentinian named Raúl Prebisch, of whom many of you must have heard. And he was an economist, and at a certain point in his life, shortly after the Second World War, 46, 47, he said, but, we ought to think about what's going on in the world system. He didn't use the term world system, in the world, as really based on this core periphery relationship. And I am going to propose, with the support of my government, the Argentinian government, that something be created called the Economic Commission for Latin America of the United Nations, which will somehow be a locus for the study of this. And now he got support from the Brazilian government and the Mexican government. So those three governments together pushed for this. Now, the United States government was very opposed to it. That's one of the battles they lost in the infighting of the United Nations. The commission was established, and Raúl Prebisch became its executive, I forget his exact title, executive director or so forth. And indeed, they started a program of research, which is very important and had an enormous impact. Now, as I say, he didn't really invent this, because as we begin to analyze the history, there are at least 2 points further back where you have basically the same idea that the world economy is based on this axial division of labor. You can go back to the Romanians, who did a lot of work in the 20s, and people have been pointing out that this was just the early version of Prebisch. And of course, Romania was precisely, by any definition of the term, a zone that located in the periphery. And then there was a man, a geographer in Germany named Fritz Röhrig, who almost no one has ever heard of, except Fernand Braudel, and he talked about Weltökonomie, and Braudel, reading this, understood him to mean what Braudel would later call an économie monde. And that's already, I have to get into language again. There's a curious thing about English, French, and German. If you take the word world economy in German, it's a capital letter, of course, because it's a noun, and it's a single word. There's no space there. Weltökonomie is just one word. Now, if you translate that into French, you can't. There is no single word in French that does it. And there are 2 possibilities. There's économie monde, and there's économie mondiale. And Braudel insisted that he was talking about an économie monde. Now, what's the difference between économie monde and économie mondiale? Économie monde has a hyphen, économie mondiale doesn't have a hyphen. Well, économie mondiale was the standard term, still is the standard term among, how shall we say it, standard mainstream economists. and it suggests that there are countries, and these countries occasionally engage in economic relations with other countries, and that's what an économie mondiale is about. And Brodel said, no. Économie monde is a world that is an economy, not the economy of the world, but a world that is an economy, okay? And an economy that is a world. So it doesn't have to be planetary. And indeed, until very recently, it hasn't been planetary. Okay, so we now have économie-monde, and Brodel writes the Mediterranean, and he writes all sorts of things which make this a major term. And when I come along and want to use the Brodelian concept, I've got the next problem in English, which is in English, how do you distinguish between économie monde, two nouns, and économie mondiale, a noun and an adjective? Well, I invented the idea that since everybody has always been using world economy in the sense of neoclassical economics, as that those relationships between countries that exist prior to this, if they just say world economy, if I want to say économie monde, I have to insist on a hyphen. So this is why my whole theory is built on a single hyphen. Okay? But again, this illustrates the complication of linguistic translation of all of these things. I hesitate to think what happens in languages which I have no ability to control, like Korean or etc. And I've discovered there are multiple different solutions and multiple different arguments about the solutions. Okay? But so the ideas that Prebisch had, he anchored, and then we go forward to Brodel and also to the dependistas. See, because the dependistas come along. Who are the dependistas? They're a series of economists who are also political activists on the political left. And they say, yes, Prebisch is right in his vision and understanding of this, but he draws no conclusions from this that are politically useful. We are going to come along and draw these conclusions. And what are the conclusions is that you have to engage in political action that will somehow de-link or strengthen the periphery in this relationship. And who is the main target of this argument? The main target turned out to be Latin American communist parties, who, they said, share the basic vision and have always shared the basic vision of the neoclassical economists of not understanding the importance of this core periphery relationship. But the dependistas, of course, there's I'm not going to give you a long history of the dependistas, but the dependistas then, of course, argue with each other, as will happen in any such movement. Now, then there's my views. I come along and I say, look, there's something in all of this, but the pieces have to be put together. There are quite a few pieces to put together. There's Brodel's insistence on the longue durée, that we can't understand anything significant unless we take it over a significant amount of time, but not over eternal time. Not because eternal time doesn't exist. Time of what I would now call a historical system, okay, which has a beginning, a normal life, and an end, okay? And then another piece that one has to put together is what defines a core peripheral relationship? Well, one of the problems about the word core and periphery is that people use shorthand all the time. And so they talk of core nations and peripheral nations, and that's wrong. I have to confess that in my very early writings, I made this error too, and I realized what was happening and tried to pull back, and people still cite me as saying core nations. Not at all. My argument is the key to a core peripheral relationship is the degree of monopolization of the product. If a product is heavily monopolized, you can make a lot of money in terms of capital accumulation. And if the product is not heavily monopolized, if it's in fact a case of actual free, how shall I say, competitive market, you can't make any money at all. You can't make any money. You just think about that for a minute. Suppose we have the perfect market as defined by classical economics. That is, we have total freedom of the factors of production. There's no constraint, no limitation. And we have an unlimited number of sellers, an unlimited number of buyers, and perfect information. Everybody knows everything. Well, then imagine what happens in that kind of situation. I'm a buyer. I know everybody's. I go out there and I say, I would like to buy something, and you're selling it to me, and you say, the price is X, and I say, that's too much, I'll go to the next guy, and I'll go to the next guy, and I'll go to the next guy, until I find the guy who'll sell it to me for a penny above cost, or maybe even below cost, right? So, because I have perfect knowledge, and I have no monopolies, and nobody makes any money. Just try to think now, today, of inexpensive clothing. Everybody makes inexpensive clothing. It's perfect competition. Competition is enormous, and that's the last place you make money. 200 years ago, when there was a relative monopoly on certain kinds of cloth making or other kinds of apparel making, you made a lot of money. So one of the processes is, of course, how you lose monopolies and find new monopolies. I'm not going to give you a long lecture on how the modern world system works, but the key is not competition. That's the myth. That's the myth that well, how shall I say? Shall I say that Adam Smith had the myth? Shall I say that Ricardo had the myth, that Karl Marx had the myth? Actually, all these people are a lot more sophisticated and a lot more interesting than the people who cite them today, who don't read them, but who do cite them all the time. Okay? So, Marx said he's not a Marxist, and that's to be taken seriously. Adam Smith could well say, I am not a Smithian, and that is to be taken seriously. Some people have even tried to take it seriously in recent years. Okay, so core periphery is not a territorial concept. It's a relationship. So that in the United States today, there are relatively monopolized, not too many, relatively monopolized products and relatively competitive products. And that's true of Paraguay, and it's true of India, and it's true of every country in the world. But if I now look at the concrete reality of this country or that country, I can say that they have a lot more monopolized products in this country and a lot less in that country. So I can notice concentrations, and with the concentrations come concentrations of classes. Because if I say I can define people as being, let's try to use neutral terms, upper strata, middle strata, lower strata, as defined by worldwide standards, then I suddenly discover that it is in fact true, the standard mantra about the United States, that this is a middle-class country. It is true that by world standards, right, 60 or 70% of the U.S. population are getting the income level, the privilege, et cetera, of middle strata, as opposed to lower strata and as opposed to top strata. And if I now go to Paraguay, I discover that the amount of middle strata people is maybe 5% of the population, maybe 7% of the population. The upper strata people are maybe 1/10 of 1%, and you've got this vast population that by world standards are at the bottom, okay? And now that has an enormous impact on politics. If you have a country in which most people are middle strata, the game becomes a game of what we have, left of center versus right of center, not much difference between basically two alternative political structures. And if you get a country which has no middle strata to count, and you just have a thin people at the top, at that point you discover that the major mode of accumulating capital is controlling the political structure, and that it's an all or nothing proposition, and then you get so-called dictatorships which are corrupt, and so forth and so on and so on. Now again, it's important to try to kind of see the total picture and see how it acts out. Now, you will all want to know what is happening today. I want to know. Everybody wants to know. And the first question to ask about that is, again, a verbal question. What is today? What years do you mean by today? Is today 2002? Or 2000 to 2002? Or 1990 to 2002? Okay. So there are different todays. I'd like to take the story from 1945. 1945 is the end of the Second World War. It's the achievement by the United States of hegemony, real hegemony in the world system. What is real hegemony in the world system? It means you get your way on, you create a world order, and you get your way 95% of the way, 95% of the time. That's an immense thing. The United States had that from 45 on. I won't spend too long explaining why the Soviet Union was engaged in a deal with the United States that permitted that and supported that. Okay? The second thing you have after the Second World War is the greatest single expansion of surplus value in the history of the modern world system. Okay? It was what I call a Kondratiev A phase, in which, well, it's one of those things where it's a rising tide lifts all boats. So some people made piles, some people made a little bit, but everybody was doing reasonably well from about 1945 to the late 1960s, okay? Now, the thing about Kondratiev A phases is there's always a B phase. The thing about hegemonic quasi-monopolies is that there are an A phase and a B phase. The hegemonic ones are much longer than the Kondratiev ones, but they coincided here. And we had this absolutely spectacular transformation of the world system, much, much, much greater than the so-called industrial revolution that occurred, or what some people call the industrial revolution that occurred at the turn of the 19th century. Basically, we had a situation in which we urbanized the world to an extraordinary extent in those 25 years. And we had a situation in which U.S. power was so much greater in those 25 years than anything previously in the history of the world system. Okay? Now, what happens with quasi-monopolies of products, quasi-monopolies in the geopolitical arena, is they're self-liquidating. They're self-liquidating for a very simple reason. If you've got a product which is monopolized and therefore is in fact a source of incredible possibilities of capital accumulation, well, other people would like to get in on the act. And there are a whole series of ways in which the people who have the monopoly try to keep them from getting in on the act, and the whole series of ways in which the people who don't have the monopoly try to get in on the act, and it usually has historically taken about 25 to 30 years before the monopoly is broken and other people do get in the act, and the situation does become more competitive, which means lower real profit and therefore lower possibilities of capital accumulation. So it self-liquidates, and then you have a B phase, and I won't go into how you get out of the B phases historically. But basically, if we've had for 500 years, up and down, up and down, up and down. Okay? The same thing with the quasi-monopoly of geopolitical power. And you have this, other people want to break it. And it's hard, it's difficult, but sooner or later it self-liquidates, because the people who have the quasi-monopoly of geopolitical power have to defend it. And they begin to have to defend it militarily. And the worst thing about military power is every time you use it, you're weaker, not stronger. Because it's always the threat of military power that is the strength. And when you use it, in fact, it turns out that you're not as good as you say. And also turns out that there's a real cost for the population of the country that's using it. And you begin to have what we later call the Vietnam syndrome, and so forth and so on and so forth. So it's a self-liquidating proposition. And around 1970, basically, both monopolies were broken. And now, when the monopoly is broken, it doesn't go from up here to down there. It's a process, right? So you can try to slow down the process, and that's what people try to do, okay? In the case of monopolies of products, what happened was other countries begin to take over this product. Right? South Korea begins to have steel mills. South Korea says, wow, we are developing. But actually what's really happening, and it's good for South Korea, there's no question, or India or anyone else, is they are getting sloughed off with the less profitable product, which is no longer profitable enough to be continued in Germany or the United States or so forth. So what they see as development can also be seen as shifting stuff into these countries that have improved their economic situation enormously internally, no question about that, but aren't at the level of the people who have monopolies. Well, then there are ways of getting out and creating new products which have monopolies. And in the process of this, you can have new areas beginning to be the locus of the new monopolies. It's a very slow process. Think of it as molasses. It moves slowly, but it moves. And what is the center today is not necessarily the center tomorrow. And we have documented that over 500 years. That's quite clear. Now, a third thing happened in the period of glorious, wondrous world from 1945 to circa 1970. And that is a very curious thing. There's something, I call them anti-systemic movements, but there are the historical anti-systemic movements. These were communist parties, these were social democratic parties, these were national liberation movements. And way back in the end of the 19th century, these movements had debates about what kind of strategy would help them come to power. And it seemed a very remote and difficult thing to do. They debated it, argued about it, and the consensus came down. No, consensus is the wrong word. The majority point of view eventually was what was called the two-step strategy. First, take control of the state, because without that you can't do anything. Then transform the world. Okay, 2 steps. Now, in 1870, or 1900, or 1920, or 1930, this seemed almost impossible. And suddenly, if you look at what happened in the world between 1945 and 1968, don't use that number without, I used it deliberately. Right? If you look at what happened, all of a sudden, anti-systemic movements came to power virtually everywhere. A third of the world was ruled by communist parties. A third of the world, what I call the pan-European world, Western Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, basically is the pan-European world. Social democratic parties came to so-called alternating power, but they came to power in a situation in which the conservative parties accepted the legitimacy of the main program of the social democratic parties, which was the welfare state. And in the last third of the world, the so-called South, national liberation movements came to power. Anti-colonial ones in Asia and Africa, populist ones in Latin America. So all of a sudden, at a moment, now think about that for a moment, at the moment when the United States and more largely the pan-European world was flourishing economically, and at the moment where the United States was the hegemonic power and could get its way 95% of the time, 95% of the issues, at that very moment, the movements came to power. Isn't that strange? And you know, it isn't really strange. again, you have to think about that. One of the reasons, I didn't go into this, one of the reasons that a Kondratiev A-phase monopoly is undermined is that if you've got a wonderful product, you're making piles and piles of money, and you're running this show, the last thing you want is a work stoppage, because you just lose money during that work stoppage. So what you do is you come to terms with the union or the workers or so forth, and you give them some more and say, don't stop, we'll raise your wages X amount, which is fine. But as the wages go up and up and up, you become less and less competitive on the world scale, right? So you have undermined yourself by what you've used to save yourself. Now, it's the same thing with a hegemonic power. If you want to keep relative order in the world, and you want to have a deal between the United States and the Soviet Union that's called the Cold War, that's going to remain cold under all circumstances and no borders are going to change, then when these groups come along in Nigeria or India or Malaysia and so forth, and they press you on some kinds of concessions, you say to yourself, well, it might be better to have some kind of peaceful transition to decolonization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, than to have a kind of violent one, which requires a lot of intervention and might become very radical in terms of what it's promoting. So you make concessions. So it's not peculiar that, in fact, at the moment of the height of U.S. hegemony and the height of U.S. and West European monopolies, the anti-systemic movements actually come to power. And that brings me to 1968, the World Revolution of 1968, which actually went on from 66 to 70, which occurred everywhere in the world, and which had some common themes everywhere in the world. Now, one of the common themes, I haven't talked about the U.S.-Soviet collusion relationship, but one of the common themes was the United States is a terrible imperialist power, and the Soviet Union is collusive with it. So this, we're against the two superpowers. Okay, that was a common theme everywhere. And then there's a second common theme everywhere, which was, these anti-systemic movements, they've all come to power. So where's step number 2, transforming the world? Right? And what the people who engaged in these uprisings, I don't know which word to use about them, these revolutions, if you will, everywhere, said to the anti-systemic movements, you have indeed come to power, you haven't changed the world. The world is just as bad as before. All right? There's the same degree of economic inequality. There's the same degree of lack of democracy, and indeed it might be even worse. There's even the same degree of the class system. So you call it the nomenclatura instead of calling it the bourgeoisie. It's the same idea. The children of this group inherit their role, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So where is this change? You are no longer part of the solution. You are part of the problem. Okay? And then there was a third theme, and that comes back to the peripheries, and one of the things I was talking about at the beginning. A third common theme was, and what about the forgotten peoples? The women, the so-called minorities who were socially defined. It could be actually a majority of the population. The sexual minorities, et cetera, et cetera. Once you go down that lane, you discover all sorts of forgotten peoples. And the anti-systemic movements had historically said, you've got to wait, because there is a group that has to come first. It has to be, the working class has to come to power, or if in the case of a national liberation movement, the nation has to assert itself first. And all those other problems will be solved later. And all of a sudden, all these movements said, no, 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 no. We're not waiting anymore. Our problems are just as urgent as anybody else's problems. They're the problems of today and not of tomorrow. And we insist that this whole idea of a vertical priority and a single vertical movement in each country is for the birds. Okay? So all of a sudden, we have a very transformed situation. Now, I see my time is running out, so let me try to quickly go to what happened. What happened is two things. One, and I haven't gone into this, the achievement in the 19th century of the dominance of centrist liberalism, turning the conservatives and the radicals into avatars, mildly different from them. What happened in '68 was they lost this monopoly, right? And all of a sudden there's the resurgence of the real right, the resurgence of the real left politically. And for the 20 or 30 years after '68, in fact, the real right, we call them by many names, neoliberals, neoconservatives, etc., won the day to about 1994. I'll come to in a minute why I picked 1994. And they actually, how shall I say, the left was in disarray, the center was struggling, and the right was gaining everywhere, and Mrs. Thatcher's "there is no alternative" was the slogan of the world. And in terms of the geopolitics, the U.S. had a whole program of slowing down its decline. This program had to do with creating, telling the West Europeans and the Japanese, we are not going to treat you any longer as satellites. We're going to make you partners, but just don't go too far away from us. Okay? And there were a whole series of other things that the U.S. did to slow down. One of the things was insisting on no nuclear proliferation, since anybody who has a nuclear weapon represents a diminution of the power of the inner core, who at that time had become the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And this more or less works until about 2000. Now what happens now is we get something precipitate. After 1994, we get 3 major events in succession. We get the Zapatistas on January 1, 1994, proclaiming armed struggle. Do you know why they picked January 1, 1994? Because it's the day of the coming into effect of the North American Free Trade Association. So they were linking their demand for autonomy, not state power, autonomy of the indigenous population, something goes back 500 years as a demand in Chiapas, and a major world thing. They were reaching out to the entire world, and they were demanding only autonomy. Okay? Then there's 1999. That's the Seattle a sudden, to everybody's surprise, and it was a surprise, right, there was a popular demonstration outside by whom? Americans, not by Chinese, not by Greeks, not by Mexicans, sorry, who were of three kinds that never had worked together before. There were the trade unions, there were the environmentalists, and they had never worked together before, and there were the anarchists. And you know what? They succeeded. They forced the meeting to adjourn without completing its agenda. It has been trying since 1999 to implement that agenda. That agenda is dead. It's dead. And then in 2001, the World Social Forum is created as a counterpoint to the World Economic Forum of Davos. And now, I see I'm at 6 o'clock. I was going to tell you, but I'll just have to tell it to you. You'll have to believe me, okay? Because I don't have more time. All right? We are in something I call the structural crisis of the capitalist world economy or of the modern world system. That's a thing that comes only every 500 years. It's not like one of these ups and downs. All right? It means that, to use the language of complexity science, the curves have moved too far from equilibrium. Equilibrium can't be reestablished. Impossible to reestablish it. The only sure thing we know about the period running roughly from 1970 to 2050 is that the capitalist world economy as a system cannot survive. The system bifurcates, and there are two then alternatives. And one alternative, logically, is to reestablish the same kind of system in terms of values that isn't a capitalist system. Right? So what are the values that we want to retain? We want to retain the value of hierarchy, of exploitation, and of polarization. There are many ways to do that that have nothing to do with capitalism. Okay? That's one alternative. I call that the spirit of Davos. Then there's the spirit of Porto Alegre. And what is that? They want a relatively democratic, relatively egalitarian world. Who will win? No one knows. That's the first thing. Impossible, intrinsically impossible to predict who will win. That's A. B, each side is split in terms of strategy. So we don't have two strategies, but four strategies. Right? And at some point it flips as the result of the infinity of nano actions by the infinity of nano actors in the infinity of nano circumstances. In other words, you know, the butterfly effect, you've heard of the butterfly effect, I'm sure, right? Right? The Lorenz, the meteorologist, demonstrated, I don't know how many years ago now, 30 years ago, that a butterfly flaps its wings over here. At the other end of the world, there is climatic change. We are all little butterflies. We are all little butterflies constantly. Okay? So the nature of the outcome depends on how many butterflies do how many things at how many moments until it flips. Now, when it flips, where are we? Well, if we're in the kind of world that the spirit of Davos wants, there will be peripheries. It'll take different forms. I don't know the forms. And if we're in the kind of world that the spirit of Porto Alegre wants, will there be peripheries? Will there be, for example, China? China's been around as a state and as a civilization for a long time. Will there be China? There'll be Chinese people. Will there be China? I don't know. You don't know. We don't know. Right? It's a new adventure at that point. And then, well, we'll have different struggles because the politics of the world go on forever, because whatever new system comes into existence will have a normal life, and at some point will go too far from equilibrium, right? And have a structural crisis, and then we'll have another bifurcation, because the bifurcations are endless. But notice this, there's no guarantee of progress. There's no guarantee that we're coming into a better world. We might be coming into a worse world, or we might be coming into a better world. It's 50-50. I leave you with that.
Thank you. I have too many questions, but I'll keep it short. And maybe that will give you a chance to develop the end of your talk, which was very intriguing, but we felt shortchanged, all of us. My question is simply that in at least some, if not most of your writings, the place of politics is less stressed than the place of economies and other such structures. But in what you talk today, active politics seems to have a space in the shifting of these systems. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that in terms of what you're seeing coming for us.
Well, to say that politics is absent from my argument is to malign me.
What can I do? I'm a humanist.
No, it's not only humanists. They're also, look, I've been accused of everything under the sun. In fact, if I can give a plug, I just put out Volume 4 of the Modern World System, and it has an introduction. And the introduction deals with all the critiques that have been made of me and of world systems analysis and why they're all wrong. But anyway, it's my response to all these kinds of critiques. So, look, one of the problems of knowledge in the modern world is that the categories we use are primarily bequeathed to us by what I call centrist liberalism in the 19th century. And one of the things that the centrist liberals argued was that what differentiates modernity from tradition or pre-modernity or so forth is the fact that there are three arenas of social action. There's the market, there's the state, and then there's the leftovers, which is called the civil society. Okay? And it is a religion to say that not only are these three separate arenas in, how shall I say, real life, but that's a good thing. That means you're modern, and therefore you have to study them separately. So we developed three nomothetic sciences of the present: economics to study the market, political science to study the state, sociology to study the leftovers, which was called the civil society. Okay? This is crazy. Okay? And I have written about that at great length in various places. This is the result of the so-called divorce between philosophy and science, which is very recent. People don't realize that only in the second half of the 18th century that it ever came into existence. It's now going to go out of existence. It's a bump, but it's an important bump in the history of knowledge. And I say that world systems analysis promotes a unidisciplinary social science in which the pieces have to be put together again, that were stripped apart and created. So there's nothing that's exclusively economic, political, or social. Everything is intertwined. Having said that, it's kind of difficult to develop a language. I myself find it difficult that doesn't fall back on that, right? In fact, I think that one of our main intellectual tasks of the next 20 to 30 to 50 years is how to begin to use a terminology that does not accept this segregation, if you will, of the so-called three arenas of social life. There are all sorts of people who attack me for being too political. And they say, oh, you know, he inserts his politics into his analysis of the market, and that's illegitimate. There are other people who say I'm not political enough. And there's some people who say he's both political and economic, and that's both are bad because, etc. So, what can I say? I certainly don't accept the legitimacy of the trimodal distinction, and I don't accept the legitimacy of the concept that there's neutral analysis over here and activism over there. We are all activists at every moment in our life, especially when we're denying it. All that happens when we're denying it is we presume. Let me tell you a little anecdote to illustrate this. This took place at Yale University, and it was maybe 1972. And we had a discussion. I guess it was the faculty of sociology had a meeting, and somebody was presenting something, and a retired member of the faculty was there, and she was what might be called a classical liberal. And she suddenly said, this other person was talking, but that's not sociology, that's socialism. See? So it couldn't be sociology if it was socialism, and it couldn't be socialism if it was sociology. And of course, all she meant was the only legitimate ideology to put forward is a liberal ideology. If you put forward a liberal ideology, then you're neutral. Okay? And if you put forward a radical one, or even a real conservative one, you're not neutral. Let me give you another anecdote about conservatism. You know, when I was a graduate student, which is now 50, 60 years ago, Milton Friedman was a joke. It was a joke. Nobody took him seriously. There's this nut, Milton Friedman, who from time to time says all sorts of silly things, but don't pay him any attention. Everybody knows, right, that Keynes is the be-all and end-all of modern economics, and every economist who's worth his salt teaches that, and nobody pays any attention to Milton Friedman. After '68, with the liberation of the conservatives from this constraint by the centrist liberals, all of a sudden, he not only ceased to be a joke, within 10 years, he became the definitive doctrine. It was now the Keynesians who had to defend themselves as being marginal and silly, right? That was very quick, okay? And it has, but basically, of course, Milton Friedman's politics are very clear. They are truly conservative politics, and John Kenneth Galbraith's politics were truly centrist politics. There's no question about that, and I don't know who to cite for. And Paul Sweezy's politics were truly radical politics, right? And they're all economists, and they're all trying to be serious economists, and they all think they're serious economists, and they all think they're putting forward how shall I say, defensible ideas. They're not fantasies. And they are serious economists. I take them all to be serious economists. And we can debate, what caused the relief from the Depression in 1939 or 40 in the United States. And Milton Friedman has one point of view, and John Kenneth Galbraith has another. But then that's a serious debate. I'm willing to enter into that debate, and they're willing to enter into that debate. But don't say that it's neutral. Of course it's not neutral.
Hi, thanks for that talk. I'm sort of inspired by your attention to language, and so I was really struck by the formulation you gave that from the hegemon's point of view, you undermine yourself by what you use to save yourself. So I was just thinking when I was listening to that, I was thinking, could you put it the other way around, or see it also as the other way around? That the hegemon or the system has saved itself by what wants to undermine it, i.e. that the accession of anti-state movements to state power, to positions within the world system, is one of the ways that the system, if not bringing itself back to equilibrium, would at least sustain itself. So just an alternative way of reading that.
Sure, it happens all the time. I mean, co-option is the easiest game in the world. It's, in fact, resistance to co-option is extremely difficult because too much resistance to co-option results in your being politically inefficacious. Look, there's a real problem here of, what we're into, basically, we're into the issue of the lesser evil. Standard politics in the wealthier countries of the world is this kind of two-party system, basically. And, you have to, you don't have to vote, but if you vote, you have to vote for one or the other. Well, you can vote for a third party. There always are little third parties, but these are basically lost votes most of the time, right? So people vote. I mean, most people who are going to vote Republican this time are voting against Barack Obama. And most people who are going to vote Democratic this time are voting against Mitt Romney. Basically, the enthusiasm for their candidate is lacking on both sides, but people feel desperately in need of doing that in order to prevent something. Well, that's a politics of the lesser evil. It's clear. You can't escape the politics of the lesser evil. It's just you have to just figure out what is the lesser evil in a given case, and it turns out to be different in Greece than it is in the United States. Now, we're in this period of transformation, right? The structural transformation of the world, right now. Okay, so do we pursue the politics of the lesser evil or not? And I argue the following. You've got to put this into a temporal context, the temporal context of the short term and of the middle term. We all live in the short term. We have to eat today. We have to sleep today. We have to have a job or not have a job today, right? We have a family. They need food. They need clothing, etc. To say to people, you can't worry about today because in 20 years the world will be better or worse or something is crazy. Everybody worries about today. And so the lesser evil is always opting for what I call minimizing the pain. I'm willing to vote myself for anybody who I think will minimize the pain in the next 3 years. Okay? Minimize the pain more than the next guy, because that's the practical need of anybody. No movement is going to get anywhere that ignores it. But minimizing the pain doesn't change the system. It never changes the system. It can't change the system. So you've got to do a second thing, which is operate in the middle term, and that is an all or nothing proposition. Either we move in this direction or we move in that direction. There's no compromise in between. It's a bifurcation, and it's fundamental, and that has to be organized. So in the short term, minimize the pain, which is opting for the lesser evil. In the middle term, no holds barred. Okay? Now, can people do that, or will they get co-opted en route? Well, people get co-opted all the time. Indeed, I didn't have a chance to go into the split in Davos and in Porto Alegre. The split in Davos is very simple. There's one camp within the Spirit of Davos group that says the way to handle this situation is hit him over the head, and hit him over the head hard. Total, ruthless repression. Dick Cheney. Clear. Total, ruthless repression. Okay? There's a second school that says that's crazy. It won't work. It never works. What you do, you have to co-opt them. How do you co-opt them? Well, it's the de Lampedusa method, right? Change everything in order that nothing change. Okay, so we'll have green capitalism, we'll have this, we'll have that, all changes that are minimal, which will co-opt people, and then 30 years down the road, we'll have this new system, which is the old system in a new form. Okay? So co-option is a very real alternative. Now, in fact, you see it going on before your eyes regularly. On the other side, and this I didn't get a chance to develop, there's the split in the camp of Porto Alegre. Because one of the conclusions people drew after the World Revolution of '68 was that we have to create horizontal movements composed of multiple different movements who talk to each other, who exchange with each other, but who don't pounce on each other, who don't denounce each other, right? And therefore have a relationship that is one of slow building of consensus among them where they can be developed. That's, in fact, the official doctrine of the World Social Forum. But within that group, there are people who say, listen, it's all very nice, but there's power in the world, and people are going to hit you over the head, and we've still got to take hold of the state structures, and we have to use them to develop in order to redistribute world income to people. This is the debate that's going on, for example, in Latin America. It's a very big debate between the so-called indigenous movements and the left parties. It's going on in Venezuela, it's going on in Colombia, it's going on in Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, everywhere. The same debate of whether you want to put your marbles in civilizational alternatives, preserving indigenous values and rights, which come back to my opening remarks, what is a periphery and what tonality you have, versus those who say that's crazy and all that will happen is that we get thrown out of power, or we won't develop. We'll just be as poor as we've always been, and so forth and so on. So these are real debates that are not yet resolved. You have to resolve them. You have to jump into the fray. You have to be part of the picture.
I wanted to ask the China question, or a China question, before we leave, and that is, if the current crisis is a 500-year crisis, as you say, is the primary axis of the crisis located between the United States and China? And if there's such thing as a kind of China model, is the China model outside the current configuration, or is it purely within the current configuration, as you say the Soviet Union was, in effect, in the previous sort of arrangement? And if there is such thing as a China model, is it a question of the reconfiguration of those three domains that we spoke of a moment ago, state and economic power and so on? Or is it all sort of a shell game? And then finally, how might we think of China's influence in what traditionally was seen as the Euro-American periphery? So, for example, increasing Chinese influence in Africa and in Latin America, where ideas like the emergence of the China model are being spoken of on the ground as a result of China's turning of those regions into peripheries in a certain extent, in a certain way, but perhaps different kinds of peripheries than in the past.
There are those. That's really a many-part question. There are those who argue that what is going on in China is somehow a different mode of political economy, of etc., a different model. I don't buy that, but I don't see that. What I see is two things. One, China has been doing very well economically by the standard mode up to now of doing very well economically, which is to organize production at lower costs on a world scale, and so forth and so on, and therefore to, in this period of how shall I say, in this period of decline in the world economy, managing to have a lot of the activity transferred to China. That, in some sense, is a traditional thing to do. Secondly, China is interested in reasserting herself geopolitically. She feels quite correctly that she's been dealt a bad deal over the years. She's a quarter of the world's population. She's now economically much stronger, so she builds an army, etc., etc., etc. And we have a government in China who are worried about two things. The first thing they're worried about is holding the country together. China has been falling apart many, many times, and indeed, as of 1945, was not a united country. It had fallen apart, and the Chinese Communist Party pulled the pieces together again, reestablished a single country. That's why they're so, how should I say, unyielding on issues like Taiwan, Xinjiang, Tibet, etc. They feel they've given an inch, they're lost. And they've been doing pretty well so far, holding the country together, which is the first thing on their mind. And the second thing that's on their mind is worrying that their economic expansion won't last much longer. And it is already on a declining slope. Why? Because their internal costs have gone up and industry has moved on to other countries, to Vietnam, to Cambodia, to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The problem that China poses to the world system is a particular one. China and India are too big for the role that they're trying to play. The idea that there's a shift in the locus of activity is an old one. It's been going on for 500 years. And basically, I schematize it as the 1%, the 19%, and the 80%. 1% of the world's population are doing extremely well, 19% are doing reasonably well, and 80% of the world's population are doing very badly. Okay. Now, what's the 19%? You can give them any name you want, call them the bourgeoisie or the middle strata or anything else. The problem of China and India is that as they have improved their economic situation, they've expanded the middle strata, but among not a small proportion of the world's population, but among 50% of the world's population. This means all of a sudden that if you calculate it on a worldwide basis, it's no longer 1, 19, and 80. It becomes 1, 29, or 39, and 60 or so. And that means it's the same amount of surplus value, or more or less, that's being created in the world system. It gets divided more thinly. And what happens is, at the top, and even in the middle, people begin to say that they're getting significantly less of the surplus value, and the game is not worth the candle. And that is why one of the major forces for the bifurcation is not merely that the people at the bottom are saying we don't like this system, which has always been true, but the people at the top are saying we don't like this system. It is no longer working for us. And that's very important to understand. So China and its success is making things worse for the survival of the capitalist world economy, not better. And therefore, yes, if they weren't so big, if they were a much smaller country, then maybe by 2075 or 2100 they would be the new hegemonic power. But they're not going to have that chance because the world system we're in isn't going to exist at that point, and whether the new system has room for something called a hegemonic power is something we don't know, can't know, but I suspect not.
We'll end on that apocalyptic note of uncertainty, and thank Dr. Wallerstein for a great talk.